Hi, Maya.
Hello.
His last name is pronounced Raun.
Ron. Ron?
Raun.
Oh dear. My dad would be so embarrassed of me.
Henrik
I
Raun.
do my best. Poor family. Heinrich Raun? Raun. No.
Raun. Of course, Helene is
I'll
better
try.
because I'm a foreigner in this country too. So Helene should help you
Okay.
if she's listening. I'm not sure. She may be
She's
just connecting.
laughing.
Okay. So what's the actual number of participants registered for the show today?
I think I heard a little over 300 of this.
That's a lot.
358 total.
That's good.
Okay.
358. Okay. Great. Well, I'm looking forward to it. It's fun. I wish we could do it in person, but in the meantime, this is good too.
Yes.
Eventually we'll get there. Ah.
So I can see Henrik has logged on as a participant, as an attendee. So maybe you should
Yes, because I don't think he can screen
switch.
share from there.
No, he can't. Oh, maybe
I just
promoted him.
Came, yes.
I have the power to give promotions.
Oh, no,
Excellent.
that's a different Henrik.
Oh.
No.
That's the wrong Henrik.
No, I think you got the right one.
Henrik Ron, not Henrik Thompson.
No, I think it's good now.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
Yes.
There he is.
Is that the right Henrik?
No.
Oh, there's Henrik Ron.
I clicked the wrong. I clicked too fast. Sorry, everyone.
Right.
Sorry to Henrik Thompson.
I'll go ahead and give an introduction now, so we can get started, I think. Henrik, are you able to screen share and talk or no? Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Wonderful.
You hear me? That's at least a start.
Yeah, it's a start.
Great. Nice to see you, Maya. Well, I've seen you for the last 10 minutes, but you couldn't hear me. Yeah.
Good. Are you able to screen share? Shall I go ahead and get started?
I think I can share, but let's see after you make the introduction. Or should we try now?
Sure. Or if there's an issue, then, well, let's just try now and then we get started. Do you want to try real fast?
Yeah, I'll try now and share.
Yeah.
I think that works fine now.
Yeah, good.
And I'll just stop sharing again.
Okay, sounds good.
But I couldn't see it myself.
Anyway. Okay. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Maya Peterson at the University of California, Berkeley, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the 2020 webinar for the Joint Initiative in Causal Inference. This webinar is going to be running 3 days this week on October 26th, 28th, and 30th. And we are hoping to have you join us for all 3 days, but they are targeted at slightly different audiences, which I'll give a little background on in a second. First, though, I want to tell this group a little bit about this joint initiative for causal inference. So this is a new partnership that was launched in the spring of 2020 between Novo Nordisk, University of Copenhagen, and University of California, Berkeley, and in particular, the Center for Targeted Learning at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. We are really excited about this initiative. The timing was quite something. We launched right as the pandemic hit, but nonetheless have really had an exciting and productive first few months of the partnership. And this will be our first webinar. And we're hoping to do a number of future ones as well. I wanted to just give a little background about the vision and mission for this initiative. So really this came out of a shared vision that, you know, all of these partners, and I think everyone on this call wants to use data better for evidence generation. And so in particular, the mission of this joint initiative is to expand the knowledge and practice of sound scientific inference anchored in the causal roadmap principles and develop methodology that makes it easy to apply these methods rigorously. And so we have a number of objectives really framed around engaging with regulatory industry agencies, industry and partners to improve the use of the causal roadmap and targeted machine learning methods, really pushing the envelope for the application of these methods to target estimands in the service of real world evidence generation. And this part of our vision really includes working with clinicians as well as regulatory agencies and industry, moving beyond trials to showcase the scientific potential of causal inference based on observational data, and really putting together software and also these webinars and tutorials to facilitate better causal inference from the data that we're able to generate as a community. So a little bit of overview of the webinar. So today, day one, again, all days are open to everybody, but they've got slightly different focuses. Day one is really aimed at a general audience with an interest in the future of trials and real world evidence generation. So no prior knowledge of targeted maximum likelihood estimation or causal inference is needed. And so what we'll be hearing from today is a little bit of motivation for causal inference methodologies and an introduction to the causal inference roadmap. On the second day, it's a little more focused on statisticians and data scientists or computation experts, although again, no prior knowledge of targeted maximum likelihood estimation is needed. We're going to focus on hands-on case studies of the roadmap and TMLE applied to, in particular, time to event outcomes in randomized control trials. And we'll hear 2 nice case studies there. And then on the third day, finally, we're aiming at statisticians and data scientists with an interest in the use of TMLE for more complex questions. So here we'll use a case study in HIV analysis to explore a range of more advanced questions that can be addressed using this roadmap, including intercurrent events and longitudinal and dynamic or personalized treatments. So without further ado, I am delighted to start our speaker lineup. And so our first speaker is Dr. Henrik Rand. With apologies for the pronunciation, my Danish family would be very embarrassed right now, but all the more reason I need to come live in Denmark for a while. Dr. Rand is principal statistician at Novo Nordisk. He joined Novo Nordisk in late 2015 after 22 years of experience from biostatistical and epidemiologic research, and is co-author of more than 150 scientific publications. He's going to be introducing us today, talking about some of the challenges of estimating treatment effects in randomized control trials. With that, I will hand it over to Dr. Rand. Oh, just a final note for questions. Please feel free to type any questions into the chat. We'll then have at the end of each speaker a moderated Q&A format. And if there are questions we don't get to, we'll be saving them and we can address them later over writing. Right. And without further ado, I would hand it over to Dr. Rand.
Am I sharing now?
You
Yes.
are, yes.
Good, and it's full screen now, I guess. And thank you for the introduction, Maya. I think round is like a raven in English, so you can go ahead and use that next time. Yes, I will share some challenges in estimating treatment effects in randomized controlled trials. And to be honest, I'm only going to pose challenges and I'm not going to give you any answers or solutions. There are a lot of people in this initiative that are much better to do that than I. So challenges ahead. So I'm going to talk about estimation of treatment effects in randomized controlled trials. And as you see here, we can say that we have randomized controlled trial data. And for that, we are randomizing subjects to treatments. That means that subjects are randomly assigned, meaning that we will have protection against systematic differences. That's the whole idea, of course, as you're all aware, from the randomized controlled trial data. On the contrary, in observational data, we do not have this randomly assignment of treatment. No subjects there are deciding to take a treatment, which of course do not protect us from systematic differences. So you can put it up very hardline and say, well, from a randomized controlled trial data, it's easy to estimate the treatment effects because we have the randomization in play. On the contrary, the observational data make it rather difficult because so many different variables and decisions are part of those taking the treatment opposed to those who do not take the treatment. There are a lot of discussions, of course, about randomized trial data and observational data studies, which one is the best, and everybody says that the trial data are the golden standard, but we should lean on observational data in circumstances where it's maybe unethically to randomize, but that is not the scope of today. I will discuss treatment effects in the trial settings and what we have a challenges there that can be revealed with some of the methods that we have from observational data. To do that, I will throughout the presentation more or less use this example from Novo Nordisk of a large outcome trial, cardiovascular outcome trial called LEADER. It's about a drug called liraglutide that helps lowering your blood sugar in type 2 diabetes population. It's not so important about all the details about how the drug, what the drug is and so on here. It's just an example where we have 9,340 subjects that were one-to-one randomized, very simple, an active arm, the liraglutide arm, and a placebo arm to that. It was a compared duration and event-driven trial, so the subject should have at least 3.5 years of duration and also a number of events of the primary event, which was MACE, which is cardiovascular events of CV death, non-fatal myocardial infarctions, or non-fatal stroke. That was the primary endpoint. And the primary objective was, as written here, to assess the effect of the treatment compared to placebo on this incidence of CV events. So that's the scope, very simple trial, you can say, randomized one-to-one, long duration though, and that's of course where some of these complications to estimating treatment effects comes in. The trial was rather flexible regarding the treatment, so the randomized treatment, the subjects were allowed to have treatment holidays, go off some period and come back on treatment again. So there could be these holes of on-treatment periods. It was also allowed to have drop-in treatments of other medications, for example, insulins and statins, etc. It was a high retention in the trial, as you can see on the flow diagram here, 97 to 96, 96.6% actually completed the study. On the right, you see the primary result that comparing the two arms with regard to the time to the first of these MACE, there was a hazard ratio of 0.87, including a confidence interval creeping below 1. And placebo is higher here than liraglutide, showing the same situation with the lower rate in the liraglutide arm. And down below, you see the number of risk, of course, going down as trial goes on. So this is a standard setup, you can say, of a cardiovascular outcomes trial. But of course, what is the effect of treatment you're actually interested in such a trial? Yeah, it of course depends on a patient's level, or on a physician level, or regulatory level, scientist level, or you name it. For example, you could ask the question, with this prescription of liraglutide, you can expect X% lower risk of CV events compared to placebo. And this was more or less the same effect that I just demonstrated to you before, or showed to you before. That was like this kind of intention to treat principle. No matter what they did they, if they continued on trial drug or not, if they took other medication, we still follow them for the MACE event. So this is the effect you would see if you simply just got the prescription and didn't know if they were taking the drug or not. Or of course, you could like to ask the question, if you take liraglutide as directed, you can expect Y % low risk of CV events compared to placebo. This is more maybe the pharmacological effect of the drug if you take the drug as you should all the way through. And of course, you could ask the question, why does liraglutide reduce the risk of CV events? Is it because there's an effect on the blood sugar or on the body weight, or is it both? So this is a question you can ask. We really want to investigate the effect. Where does it come from? Or who will actually benefit most from the liraglutide? Is it those who actually had a response in the early days of the trial? Or you could also ask, if you however also start another medication during the trial, then the effect of liraglutide would be X and Y and Z. So many of these questions can be posed, and so we have to be clear what the treatment effect of interest is before we actually present the result to others, so they can interpret it in the correct way. So going back to randomization, that helps us a lot. That's not a lie. Of course, it helps us a lot. At least at the baseline here is the baseline table from the LEADER study. Of course, you should not read it through, but it indicates simply that at baseline, all these factors that we have listed here, they are balanced between the two randomized groups. How about being off drug during the trial? Here are some curves that is not from the LEADER trial, I must admit, but from another trial, but it is the same idea. This is a probability curves of being off drug during the trial. One region compared to another, you see a huge, large difference between these two regions. So something happened between these two regions. The region 1 has a lower treatment adherence, while region 2 has a higher treatment adherence. So there are some differences here between regions. So now the imbalance starts to creep in. What about these other treatments that you can allow to take during the trial? Well, for example, the insulin initiation is drawn here. As you see, the gray one is the placebo and the blue one is the LARA. So in the placebo group, there was a much higher uptake of getting insulin during the trial, which of course is imbalanced in the two treatment arms with regards to the insulin use. Is that important for the treatment effect? Get back to that later. When discussing these treatment effects, it's common nowadays to call things that happens during the trial for intercurrent events linked to the much discussion there is about estimates. I will not go much into estimates here, but just say to you that this is where the wording comes from, the intercurrent events. And just to be clear, that an intercurrent event is one that occurs after the treatment initiation and either precludes the observation of the variable of interest or affects its interpretation. And it does complicate the definition and calculation of the treatment effects in the end. So here's a patient A that do or fare as we want to, take the randomized drug, and we see the primary variable while the patient is still on drug, and nothing has really happened to this patient during the trial. Now, different scenarios, of course, is two patients A, B, and C in the leader trial. The first B here decides to continue the treatment after some time and never goes back on treatment, even though the person was allowed to have holidays and go back. But maybe there was an adverse event that actually prevented the patient B to wanted to go back on treatment. Patient C also have a drop out of the treatment in the period, but then comes back and then have another drop out later on. So these are so-called treatment holidays, the gray ones. Have patient D and E that is somehow lost to follow up for different reasons. The first one here is simply lost for the trial team. They contacted the person so many times but couldn't get hold of the person. The second one, patient E here, simply withdraw from the trial because of personal issues maybe. So these, of course, missing information about the primary variable in the end because of these intercurrent events. Another one is these drop-in treatment that I just alluded to before, the insulin. It could be other drugs. In some of our new trials where we investigate other compounds will also drop in, and that's particularly of interest to us to have an analysis of those going forward. So it's most of interest here. Also, of course, very important in these longer trials and in a trial where you have CV death and a high risk of death in general, a death is clear in intercurrent events that precludes any observation of what will happen afterwards. So I'll take some of the intercurrent events here and discuss in a little bit more detail. So here's the treatment discontinuation, those subjects that are off treatment from periods or maybe from one point in time for the rest of the trial. You see the primary analysis in trial is I have called in trial as this is all data. That's the intention to treat estimate. That was the overall primary estimate from the trial. In a subregion, as I just showed you before, there may be a high number of people going off treatment, meaning that the in trial estimate may be far from the primary analysis in trial. So if we try to make an on-treatment effect of the trial, then you get something that is closer to the primary analysis. Not saying that these two should be the same, because the primary analysis is still a mix of in-trial and, of course, on and off treatments. But how to do this on-treatment analysis, that is, of course, the question. And censoring is, of course, the standard way of doing or initial thought to do. But there will be selection bias and who is actually going off treatment, all the different aspects that you go off. Why did they go off? Should we factor that into the equation when doing these analysis? This analysis is rather simple, simply censoring those going off drug. So the randomization is broken here. We need to do additional analysis to investigate. Now for the drop-in treatments, you have seen this figure before with the time to insulin initiation. Definitely you have a differential drop-in the two arms here. So the question is how to estimate the effect of liraglutide adjusted for this insulin drop-in. And in general, the challenge is to define what do we mean by adjusted treatment effects or even treatment interactions in trials. Would it be interesting to see the liraglutide effect among those who took compared to those who did not take insulin? An initiation of a drug may occur in response to a symptom of the disease under study. This is so-called photopathic biases that are in play in such analysis, which is really difficult to grasp and get us. But in general, you can say the randomization again broken here. So it's not helped that we have randomized from the beginning on this problem because the differential drop-in. Then there is the competing risk, that is the death, intercurrent events of death. Here in the leader study, we have the curves of all-cause mortality. There is a higher mortality in the placebo arm compared to the active arm. So here you have also already, you can say, a broken thing for the randomization. So if you want to analyze time to non-fatal myocardial infarctions, you have to take into account that people will die in a different way in the two arms, or at least in a different rate in the two arms. Other example of this competing risk could be on some biomarkers here are the so-called EGFR and UACR. It doesn't really matter what they are, but it's just some continuous variables measured during the trial to investigate those. And those curves here has not taken into account that you are able to die. So what should we actually do about that? In the analysis, those who are close to getting die may have some strange values of this EGFR and UACR that needs to be handled in another way in a standard regression analysis as is done here. So here again, I would say that randomization is broken and we need to do something else than we're used to. Yeah, here's a continued example of the intercurrent events competing risks. Now looking at recurrent events, it was not something that was planned in the primary leader study, but it could of course be interesting to look at recurrent hospitalizations, for example, for heart failures, which is a reflection of disease burden instead of only looking at the first event. Again, we have the competing risks, so what to do about that? Here are some curves from the leader study from the recurrent hospitalizations, where the blue and red one are estimates of the mean cumulative function, that is the expected number of events on average for each of the subjects of these heart failures, without adjustment for competing risk. Now the two lower curves are then adjusted for competing risk, meaning that if you do not adjust for the competing risk in this simple figure, you will get an overestimating of the number of events. It's a rather complicated story about the recurrent events. As if you have a treatment that actually kills you, that's the best way to prevent additional recurrent events. So it's a subtle analysis that needs to be in play here. Leaving a little bit the intercurrent events, we also have other problems in data with such a long duration as the leader. There will be missing data for lots of reasons. For example, the body weight endpoint was also investigated in leader, and you can see here a mean for the body weight of the subjects, and there was an analysis at 3 years, 36 months of time. You can see approximately 20% were missing at this pre-specified analysis time. What to do about that? We know all that we can use multiple imputation and so on, but should we also impute those who died, or what should we do? And you can imagine different hypothetical scenarios for those who were missing and get strange results for that. That was just for an exemplification. So now we discussed a little bit about intercurrent events that can make the treatment effects difficult to estimate and understand what it actually is for an effect we're estimating. There are also other aspects of a trial where you actually want to understand the effect that you have seen, of course being aware of what is the effect that you're estimating, but help understanding the effect could be done for these mediation analysis. And the mediation analysis, where you want to say that if you have a treatment, it has an effect on for example, blood sugar as liraglutide have. So is all the effect of the liraglutide on the MACE coming through the blood sugar, so there's no direct effects from the treatment on the outcome? And that is, of course, complicated to look at. Blood sugar levels can be measured by A1C, and that is what is done on this rather interesting analysis on the right. The two other outer curves are the observed curves, while the one in the middle is a curve trying to estimate what the placebo effect would have been if the placebo effect counterfactually would have observed the same effect on the A1C level as one in the LIRA arm. You can see this creeps closer and closer to the LIRA arm. So there seems to be some kind of mediation here. But that is, of course, very difficult because the treatment has an effect on blood sugar and the blood sugar has an effect on the treatment, even though that it was randomized during the trial. Well, now I leave the leader, not only talking about the leader here. There's another new trial called Cancer trial looking at the treatment called canakinumab, which is an anti-inflammatory treatment in cardiovascular disease as well. So this was also a cardiovascular outcomes trial with this canakinumab and a placebo group. So there are 3 doses. I will not go into all the details, of course, here, but just say that this canakinumab has an impact on the CRP level as a marker of inflammation on these subjects. So it reduces the inflammation in these subjects. And that is measured by this HSCRP. And overall, there is an effect, as you can see on the right with these curves. At least here I have shown the 300 milligram, the high dose. It seems to be better to get this canakinumab. But the researchers also wanted to know who actually benefited the most from this, or where is the treatment effect coming from. So they also did an analysis where they looked at, well, I should say that this canakinumab is given every 3 months. It's not so often they get it. So after one dose, they could measure after 3 months the level of the HSCRP. And then they did like this. They looked at the active group, divided the active group into 2 groups. Those who at 3 months had a CRP measure that was below this 2 milligram per liter and above 2 milligram per liter, meaning that the red one are those who have responded rather nicely on the canakinumab treatment, and the blue one is those who didn't react that much. And then you have the overall placebo written here, shown here as well. So now we can ask, do those who actually get a response get a better effect on the MACE? It looks like this, but of course the analysis has a lot of difficulties because the placebo group is not divided into those who would have responded if they have gotten the canakinumab treatment here, meaning it's an unfair treatment. Also, you need to exclude those who actually had an event before 3 months, at least because the effect itself could have an effect on the CRP level. So there are a lot of difficulties in an analysis like that, where you want to see who responded and what are their effects, what is then the effect on the primary endpoint. So you have to really think about think yourself a little bit about. The final one shown here is also not from LEADER. It's just to discuss a little bit about, we have discussed a little bit about the different effects you want to estimate. When you have decided on that, how are you going to estimate it? Typically we use this hazard ratio. But in a situation like this, I guess most of you know, we need to have proportional hazards, and the probability curves here really cross. So most likely the hazard curves also cross. So the hazard ratio here, at least for the whole trial, is not a good idea. And these guys in this trial, I don't want to go into the details of what the treatment is about here, just to show, of course, this is a problem that we need to think about. And they used the logistic regression with follow-up as a log transformed offset with the time. You could also have used risk difference or risk ratios and landmarks times, or even restricted mean survival. But that is also, I think, interesting to discuss what we should do in these situations. I think this workthrough of different scenarios and challenges in randomized clinical trials or controlled trials should have shown that protection from randomization are challenged when estimating treatment effects. So what started out as a randomized trial may effectively become an observational study, at least for some analysis. But inference is possible without the protection from randomization if we merge these two into each other and, of course, have a joint initiative for causal inference. That, of course, I look very much forward to see what comes out. And this is thanks to Kaiser and Randy and Søren and Lars from Novo Nordisk for these slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. That was a wonderful summary, I think, of the work that lays ahead of us and how impactful it can be. Before we move on to our next speaker, are there any questions from the attendees or in the chat?
We haven't had any questions posed during the talk, but feel free to put them in the chat now, or you can raise your hand to talk, and I can call on you from the attendee list.
I have these yet, correct? Just be sure here.
Right. All right, well, I think without any questions, let us just go ahead and move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker will be Dr. Thomas Gerds, who's a professor of biostatistics at the University of Copenhagen. Dr. Gerds' research is about theory and applications of statistical methods for binary, longitudinal, and time-to-event data, also with a focus on study design, causal inference, and machine learning for pharmacoepidemiology. And among many other things, he collaborates with the Danish Heart Foundation and associated research groups on registry data studies. His talk today will be a rate is a rate and an odds are odds, or no, odds are odd, excuse me. Thank you very much, Dr. Gerds.
So can you hear me and see my slides?
We can, they look great.
Excellent. So my research is not about randomized trials so much, but more about observational studies. And in particular, what's very important is communication. So I want to start out here with the purpose of warming up the crowd for Maya. I will start out with a discussion that someone can have with someone else. So the question is, hey, you look old today. How long does it take you to bike to work? Now, for you Americans, this may seem like an odd question, but imagine a counterfactual world where you have bike lanes. And then the answer could be, okay, it takes me 10% longer than last year. Of course, this person was 1 year younger last year. And of course, we could have instead asked a completely different question. We could have asked about the 5-year risk of cardiovascular disease. And then the answer here, the problem with the answer is that the information is not really good enough. It doesn't really answer the question. And in fact, the information that we get from this 10% longer than last year is comparable to what we get when we look at a 1.1 hazard ratio, let's say for the 5-year, for the hazard rate of cardiovascular disease. Now, the next discussion point could be, I see, so if your bike ride is 800 meters and at last year you rode on average 13 miles per hour, then this just costs a red light, so almost nothing. So the effect would be very small. And the answer, yes, that's true, but my ride is much longer. And in order to be really honest, compared to last year on going uphill, I was actually 20% slower. Maybe I was much lighter last year, whereas downhill, I'm suddenly 30% faster. And when we now look at that, so the duration of the bike ride depends on the baseline rate and the distance. And when we look at the second here, then this clearly would violate the proportional hazard assumption, because on part of the road, the change would be 20% in the one direction, and other parts of the road, 30% in the other direction. And I want to discuss today here 3 principles of statistics, and they are about a lot about honesty. So the first 2 are about honesty. We should write down the analysis plan and stick to that plan as they do in randomized clinical trials. When we do analysis of observational study, we should, as much as possible, try to achieve honest inference where we account for all the data-dependent steps on the way when we calculate standard errors for our final conclusions. And then we should stick to the correct interpretation and let a rate be a rate and odds be odds. And I admit that these principles are very hard to meet when we are just working out based on what we can learn in a course in biostatistics. And maybe this initiative is, in my perspective, is a key to moving to something more workable. I want to discuss today the story based on an example, and the example is the relation between diabetes and depression. And I'm picking a meta-analysis. I'm picking a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study, starting with the meta-analysis here. The objective, that's from 2001, the objective was to look at odds and prevalence of clinically relevant depression in adults. And the conclusion, the major conclusion here was the presence of diabetes doubles the odds of comorbid depression. And I can tell you the prevalence was between 20 and 30%. So odds in that case do not translate directly into risks. And further, we need to note here what they have done. They have been discussing several papers, and all these papers had different sources of data, and they were mostly focusing on sources of data where there were both a group of diabetics and a group of non-diabetics. And when we now translate the odds of this study, then to be more honest, these are the odds of ongoing depression on a random day in the life of a diabetic patient. In fact, no matter the duration of diabetes. And these odds were twice as high compared to the odds of ongoing depression on a random day in what I call the meta-analysis mixture population of so far non-diabetic persons. And I would remark that if people got used to this type of information, then they should not have a big problem moving to causal inference with the counterfactual variables and counterfactual hypothetical worlds. Now, the next study form here is the cross-sectional study. And in this study, they have been not able to decide which model they wanted to use. So they have a crude model where the only variable is the diabetes versus non-diabetes. Then they have an age-sex socio model where they adjust for age, gender, and socio variables. And then they have a fourth model including also comorbidities. And you can see that both the significance changes, but also the odds ratio changes a little bit. And then they also use a model as model diagnostics. They use the Hosmer-Lemcho statistic. And here the p-value was 0.08. And because it was above 0.05, they concluded that this was a satisfactory fit. And I want to get back to that statement a little later. For now, I want to switch to the longitudinal cohort study form. And this here is a paper from 2020, so very, very recent. And here, the first statement in the abstract is a misunderstanding of the meta-analysis that I showed you 2 or 3 slides ago, where the depression is twice as common in individuals with type 2 diabetes. That's not true. It's the odds are twice as high, and that does not translate into this statement that we see here. And then they have a different study form. So they use Cox regression and follow people until the next incident depression situation. And they relate this increased risk of incident depressive symptoms using Cox regression with, here they report in the abstract, the fully adjusted hazard ratio per 1 standard deviation of the marker HbA1c. But when we look at this translation between hazard ratios and risks, then I want to state that the effect, say, on the 1-year risk of incident depression is not very clear from the statement put in terms of a hazard ratio. And it would depend on the baseline rate and the other risk factors and on the validity of the model, whether we and how we would translate from the hazard ratio into a risk statement. And when we look at the statistical method section of the longitudinal study, then here I have in red corrected what I think needs to be corrected. So hazard ratios do not directly indicate increased risk. They do indicate increased rates. And they do that depending on which other variables are in the model. And as you will see in a little bit, there will be various other models with various other conditioning risk factors, and that will, of course, change the interpretation. There's one more thing I want to say here, and that's they were censoring participants in case of attrition. And here one has to be aware of that the Cox model also makes an assumption regarding the non-informativeness of the censoring, as we have heard Hendrik discuss quite nicely. Now, when we look at further at the statistical method section, then also in that study, they could not really decide beforehand which model they want to use. So in addition to the crude model, they have the first adjusted model, the second adjusted model, and the fourth adjusted model. And then there were several additional analyses. So in total, for each of the markers that they are studying, they have 15 different models with 15 different condition sets put in one paper. And then finally, they say a two-sided p-value below 0.05 was statistically significant. Now let's look at the results. We see here from the crude model, we have a hazard ratio of 1.44, and then it does change according to what I put into the model. And then people usually like to compare these numbers and draw conclusions from the comparison. However, I'm saying this is a moving target. So the interpretation of these variables does depend on which variables are in the model. So we cannot compare them directly due to the non-collapsibility of the Cox regression model. We look here at the additional models. So here's model 5, 6, and model 13. Then it gives a quite unclear picture. Some of the p-values are not significant, but the conclusion in the paper was then that the additional adjustment was not materially changing the associations. Finally, in this longitudinal cohort study, they were also mentioning that they were testing for whether there was an interaction with gender. And I'm not sure what they would have done had their interaction test rejected. But I guess then the final model would have included the interaction term. And my point here is when we do such model checking, goodness of fit tests, and then react according to them, then the final model p-values do not account for the variability and are inflated low. And that could very well impose important problems here. And we can ask ourselves, are all these models correctly specified? Are these results still significant? And are the conclusions meaningful? And the traditional thinking would help us here. They would say, okay, someone should go ahead and check the assumptions of all these models and correct the inference for all data-dependent decisions and also for multiple testing. However, because the proportional hazard assumption cannot be true theoretically for all the 15 models, I don't think it's a very useful way of thinking. Anyway, let's look at this. So goodness of fit tests, they would traditionally use the same data as used for fitting the model, also for doing the goodness of fit statistics, and that would often lead to overfitting or untrustworthy results. It is totally unclear in which order to test the goodness of fit of the model. So when you have 15 variables in your model, then which variable do you start with regarding interactions, linearity, and proportional hazard? So there's some kind of ambiguity, and this could also lead to unstable results. And finally, what would happen if the assumptions are not met? What if the model goodness of fit test rejects? What are the alternatives to the model? And when we look here at the Cox regression model, then Cox model goodness of fit, and this is maybe something you would learn in the course of biostatistics, then the null hypothesis of the model is proportional hazards, linear effects, no interactions, and non-informative censoring. And the alternative hypothesis would be any violation of these assumptions. And there are two possible outcomes. We could either wrongly reject. So we reject that, saying we would say there's a violation of this assumption, and we should then move away from our nice Cox regression model. And this way we may lose some power. However, we could also wrongly accept, meaning we trust our Cox regression model and miss that some of the assumptions are violated, and this could introduce serious bias. And I think we can agree that in this case, bias trumps power, and maybe the roles of the null and the alternative should be exchanged. Of course, this is not extremely simple, and when I have to face this question myself, then this is an analysis that I did in the beginning of the COVID-19 period, where we had not a lot of time to do our analysis. So this was a paper written within, I guess, it was 8 days. So within 8 days, we collected the data, did the statistical analysis, submitted to the journal, and then the editors were doing the refereeing. And this here was the very last statement from the editors of a quite prestigious journal. They were having 2 more queries about our nested case control analysis. And one was they were completely confused about that the nested case control analysis did not result in odds ratios, but in hazard ratios. But I think we clarified that quite clearly. But the other was more severe. We should add how the proportional hazard assumption was tested and whether the test was met. And of course, there was not just one variable. So how, in which order, and there were several other assumptions that are not mentioned here, but of course, as important, like interactions and other assumptions of the Cox model mentioned before. So I was in trouble and I got 6 hours to solve this. And my solution here was to write the following. We tested the assumption of the Cox regression model, all of them, by comparing the results of an average treatment effect estimate for 30-day risk of severe outcome after COVID-19 infection using a random survival forest. And I was then comparing the Cox model result with the random forest model result, and then kind of concluding from that, but not really. But we got away with this one. Okay, so to conclude here from my observations of the current procedures in applied biostatistics, the epidemiological studies that we are so used to have often a rather vague way of conclusion. So it's actually sometimes forbidden to say the word causal. So we're only getting associations. And if you agree with me, then some of the odds ratios are really difficult to understand. And it's not getting much better with the hazard ratios. And when we do not understand our results, then it doesn't help so much to just rephrasing them and calling the odds ratios for risk ratios and the hazard ratios for risk ratios, because then we're just cheating ourselves. So the conclusions are not very strong. So we should be honest and say they're not very strong. Then I believe that the concept of an independent predictor, which is obtained by comparing crude, adjusted, and fully adjusted logistic and Cox regression models, is a huge misunderstanding. And in fact, the reason is that both the logistic regression and the Cox regression are non-collapsible models, and they target different parameters, and therefore it doesn't make a lot of sense. But the answer is not so far. So hopefully we get to this. We get this implemented. So a great alternative to, say, the 15 unplanned models that we were seeing in the longitudinal study here would be a cross-validated superlearner, which could very well use the loss function of the goodness of fit test, but then use cross-validation or data splitting to make the inference valid. And the superlearner could very well use a random survival forest as one of the learners. And an alternative to an analysis with a moving target, where we all the time, when we change the conditioning set, change the target parameter, then we could instead use a well-defined causal parameter. And that's the part of the beginning of the roadmap. There you have to define what you want to estimate. And this is the first and most important thing to think about. And I really hope that this will become a more general recipe for honest inference. And the challenge is that we need to teach this to many and achieve a lot of good collaborations between biostatistics and medical research. And yes, this was my last slide. So thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas. Do we have any questions please feel free to type any questions into the Q&A, or I think you can also raise your little blue hand if that works, and feel free to ask them in person. I know there was one question from the previous talk asking, is the hazard ratio the appropriate estimate to produce in the future? So great question. I love it. In fact, that is one of the themes of day 2 of this webinar. So we'll actually spend a little time in depth looking at first just an overview of the limitations of the hazard ratio, which I think many on this webinar are familiar with, and Thomas did a really nice job highlighting again really what some of those limitations can be, even in the context of a randomized controlled trial, as Henrik pointed out. And then we'll talk, so we'll do a bit of that on day 2, but then we'll talk in depth about what applying a causal roadmap and then targeted machine learning looks like in the context of a randomized controlled trial with a time to event outcome, where classically the primary analysis is a Cox model. So stay tuned for that. I would guess the spoiler would be no, in most, if not all cases, the hazard ratio is probably not the estimate we should be targeting, but let's consider some alternatives. And so we'll be coming back to that. Henrik or Thomas, did you want to add anything to answering the question about the hazard ratio? All right, in that case, I will move on to these 2 other questions. So we have from Torkild, looking at data before planned analysis. Years ago, I had a chance to ask Don Rubin about this, and he said he never plans analysis without looking at the data. Maybe it depends on what we're looking for. Oh, this is a great question. Who wants to take this? Actually, Mark, are you online? Do you want to, since we haven't had a chance to hear from you yet, or maybe Tomas, do you want to go first, and then maybe Mark?
I think Mark is having, because Orenda doesn't have electricity.
Can you hear me? This is Mark.
Yes,
oh,
yes,
great.
I can hear you. Yes.
Oh yeah, I somehow got in spite of having no electricity. But you want me to start answering that question about the Don Rubin?
You or Tomas?
Well,
yeah,
no, fine if Mark answers.
Guys, I think this is referring to when Don Rubin says this. He's referring to the typical approach where people first do matching with outcome blind data, right? So you only have coverts and treatments, and you have this kind of observational data, and you need to plan an analysis for going after some causal effect. And then they think of having this kind of outcome blind data. They think of that as part of the design stage, and they feel they're kind of free to play with that because they don't have the outcome, so you cannot really cheat. And then based on that, they decide, okay, maybe I should be trimming out these observations because they cost too much, positivity violation. They call it trimming. And so you're kind of deciding on what the estimate is going to be. And then typically they will do the average limit effect, but in principle, you could even decide that. And so I think that's what he's referring to when he says, I'm always first look at the data before I plan the analysis. And I think that is fine. I mean, in other words, the idea of using outcome blind data to start thinking about what do I really want to define as my estimate of interest, right? Because you might find out that maybe a particular estimate you thought you cared about has no support in the data. So in other words, if you would go after it, you would have zero power because you can already see that because there's too extreme confounding going on. So so it makes a lot of sense that if you are in that situation where you have outcome blind data, that you can use that to decide on, in particular, specifying the target estimate, and then there are many ways to do that. But I think this is the background from Don Rubin, where he's relating to.
Thomas, do you want to add to that?
I think this is a good way of answering the question. I totally mean that when you look into this paper with 15 different models, then they have not just used outcome blind data, they have been analyzing the data, and then afterwards they could not do anything more honest than showing everything. And I don't think they are to blame because they are missing a better way of doing this.
That's a great, I think that's a really important point as well, that it's not so much an exercise in gotcha, you did it wrong, but it's that we need new tools that will help all of us do better. And I think that's one reason we're, I think, also excited about this initiative. Yes. So we have one more question before we go to a 5-minute break. So we have a question from Jonathan Bartlett. Is it really true a random survival forest makes no assumptions?
Well, it's a machine learning procedure which doesn't make any assumptions, but of course you can discuss. Then we need to discuss what it means to make no assumptions. So whether it can be consistent in a non-parametric model without any assumptions on the non-parametric model, I don't think so. I think we need to guarantee that some of the things are quite well behaved. In particular, when you have a continuous covariate, then you cannot allow that the whatever true distribution condition on that covariate behaves like a Brownian motion or something. That's not that we cannot identify.
Yeah, so it's more than consistency, right? That's what you're also saying. We need actually theory which says that this estimator would work and give us a valid confidence intervals.
Yes.
And that's where we have serious concerns.
Yes.
Great. So I think we're at time. There's a question about the effectiveness in subgroup analyses and what are the best ways of doing this. That is a wonderful topic. We will actually touch on that in our third day, talking about the causal roadmap to go after more complex causal questions, including combining both sort of subgroup discovery or treatment effect heterogeneity with rigorous inference. So stay tuned for that. Let's break now. We're going to take a 5-minute break and we'll come back at 2 minutes after the hour. Thank you, everyone. All right, I will go ahead and get started with the next part of our first day of the webinar. So for this last part of our first day, with that beautiful introduction and motivation from Henrik and Thomas, I'm going to be talking a little bit at sort of the 10,000 foot level about what this causal roadmap is and how it can help guide us from questions and answers to questions and data to answers and impact. So I am an associate professor at University of California, Berkeley in biostatistics and chair of the biostatistics division. And it's a pleasure to be here today. I'll note also joining from Berkeley is Professor Mark Vanderlaan, who's a professor of biostatistics and statistics there, but we're being affected by rolling blackouts in California. 2020 continues to be an interesting and exciting year, but is able to join us by phone today. And again, please feel free to type any questions into the chat during the talk. We will take them at the end. So I think everyone on this call is completely convinced that we live in this landscape of opportunities. And Thomas really highlighted some of those in his, or sorry, Henrik really highlighted some of those in his introductory talk. So we have a huge array of clinical trial data and really the opportunity to ask more questions, more diverse questions, more informative questions from our trial data. What we haven't talked about a lot so far is the fact that we also have rich and diverse data sources from other places. So registry data, electronic health records, and we also have at our fingertips powerful new analytic tools. So all sorts of machine learning methods, as well as unprecedented computing power. And this of course brings us to the promise. I mean, this is the promise of big data and smart analytics in the modern world. Can we transform our new analytic tools and our rich data sources into novel insights for how better to treat our patients, how better to deliver care, to actually turn this into impact to make people's lives better? So I'm calling that destination the promised castle in the woods. So we've heard this morning a bunch of ways we could do that. Do better at real world comparative effectiveness, go after long-term cumulative effects of regimes and get insights into the mechanisms by which our agents act, uncover unexpected benefits and risks, for example, from registry or post-market data. We also could take our estimates from trials and think about how can we, in a rigorous, principled way, extrapolate those effects into new populations. And then finally, there's the promise of personalized medicine. So there was a question in the chat right at the end of the last talk about subgroup effects. So absolutely, we have a range of new analytic methods that we could use to say which types of patients are going to respond best to which treatments. And when should we initiate therapies? When should we modify them? When should we intensify them? Can we make those decisions based on what's happening to our patients themselves or our participants? And can we learn how to do that better in a rigorous way, drawing on the strength of both causal inference and statistical theory? So lots of potential, easy to get excited, but also really very easy to get lost. And I think both Henrik and Thomas spoke to some of the ways that can happen. So I made a running example for this talk just to show us where we could get to, but where we might get lost and how using a causal roadmap can help us navigate this tricky path through the woods. So let's say as our example then, we want to know which second generation insulin analog is better for blood glucose control. And let's say to start off with that we agree on some basics. So we obviously need to define our target population, what are our inclusion criteria, what are we talking about as a baseline time point, and we need to agree on an outcome. So for example, blood glucose control at 180 days post-baseline. So say we agree on these things, we have maybe an apparently simple causal question. And this would often be called the average treatment effect. So how would hemoglobin A1C at 180 days differ if, for example, all subjects in our target population were treated with degludec versus all were treated with glargine 300? So here we go, we're setting off for that castle in the woods, setting off in terms of our average treatment effect. We've got our bags packed. And immediately, of course, we run into the challenges of real world data. As Henrik also started his talk with, we have, of course, classic confounding. So the fact that if we look at real world data outside of a trial, patients who receive degludec will differ in general from those who receive Glargine 300. And this may be in ways that affect or might be correlated with risk of poor glucose control. So we can think of our patients have, including maybe their treatment history, their comorbidities, their demographics, and those can determine both which insulin analog they get and also can affect their long-term outcome. And so if we don't handle these somehow, we're not going to be able to go after the real-world comparative effectiveness of these two drugs. Okay, so we know that this is sort of classic clinical epidemiology. We need to adjust for confounders. But immediately the issue comes up, as Thomas nicely illustrated, which variables should we adjust for? So if you think about our registry data, our EHR data, we have a huge potential adjustment set. So already the paths in the wood are beginning to branch. But say we even agree on our large adjustment set, we're still stuck with how actually do we go about doing this adjustment? So many of us were trained in terms of approaching questions like this to fit a parametric outcome regression. So it may be various types of multivariable regressions. Immediately though, again, we're faced with questions. So what's our model specification? We have this very large set of adjustment variables. Okay, maybe what we were taught was, well, look at your outcome. If it's a binary outcome, do a logistic regression. If it's a time to event outcome, maybe a Cox model. All right, well, what about the assumptions underlying those model specifications? And then beyond that, which variables do we put into this model and how? Main terms, interactions, polynomials, nonlinearities. There's a huge set of possible decisions we could be making. Or maybe you say, no, I don't want to use an outcome regression at all. Instead, I'm going to use some sort of propensity score based method. So instead of estimating how my outcome depends on adjustment variables and covariates, instead I'm going to estimate my propensity score, or the probability of receiving degludec versus glargine given my adjustment variables. But in that case, I've just moved my problem from one place to another. Now again, I have to specify a model. Which variables am I going to include? Main terms, interactions, and then what am I going to do with this propensity score once I have it? I could match, I could inverse weight. Huge number of possibilities. So what do? How do we find our way through these paths? I think the sort of strategy number one, which has things to recommend it, is that we should be flexible. We want to use our knowledge. We want to look at the data. This also gets at some of the questions that came up in the Q&A session. Unfortunately, as Thomas showed, in practice, what this means often because people are lacking better options is to try out a bunch of parametric models and estimators, maybe look at some goodness of fit tests, choose the approach with results that either make the most sense or meet some goodness of fit criteria. So there's this explosion of paths in the woods, and if we're kind of making it up as we go, we introduce all of these perils of getting lost. So first of all, we can underestimate our uncertainty simply because we're not accounting for this process of model selection. And we also really open the door to bias. And this is not because researchers are generally nefarious people who want to find the wrong answer, but as human beings, we're very good at creating narratives. And there's this tendency to confirm what we expect to find. So we look at our data and we say, gosh, this doesn't make sense. Oh, I know why. I didn't think about X. So maybe I'll just add X till things start to make sense. But of course, this leads us into all sorts of concerns with valid statistical inference. And so here is a cartoon that I particularly like from about 8 years ago that shows significance. And here's the pack of p-values approaching significance. It was amazing. The alpha male, a majestic 0.06, was seen slowly but surely approaching significance, followed closely by a small group of marginal p-values. After seeing p-values approaching significance, what we really want to observe is p-values retreating from significance, but that kind of behavior has never been reported. So many paths. How do we find our way? So we talked about the advantages or the attraction, but also the perils of looking at the data, making decisions based on what we find in our data, but there's huge perils there. So another option, of course, and this gets back to one of Thomas's core principles of statistics, is fully pre-specify our analysis. So before looking at the data, we want to pre-specify our choices. Our adjustment variables, our estimator, our model specification. And really, this is a core foundation of statistics. It protects against researcher degrees of freedom. It makes sure that our statistical estimator is actually a well-defined algorithm. We could imagine applying it again and again. But of course, if we're stuck with a standard toolbox, we're still faced with this explosion of possible paths. So if really all we have to choose from when we're taking this route of pre-specifying a parametric model, say an outcome regression, is we need to write down all these choices ahead of time, and we just don't know enough to do it well. Relationships in the real world are complicated. We don't understand them fully. And so our carefully pre-specified parametric outcome regression might fit the data terribly. So we've kind of moved from one problem to another. We're back in the world of bias and misleading inference. So to sum up, say we start with a statistical target parameter, and I'm using estimand here for that, although I know it's used in different ways in different literatures. We have a statistical target parameter. We have standard statistical approaches to get us to an estimate and inference. But kind of the two classic things we have in our tool belt to approach this problem are both subject to real limitations. We have our pre-specified parametric models that can lead us into model misspecification and bias. And we have our exploratory common sense, where we really run the risk of underestimating uncertainty and human bias. And so what these give us really is this potential for a statistical gap between our target parameter and the things we want, which are good estimates, good, precise, unbiased estimates with rigorous inference. So this is all just statistics. We haven't even talked about causal inference. Forget about that. We don't even have reliable statistical inference in this case. But then what about that causal question? Let's go back to the beginning. Did I ask the right causal question? So this is where I think is another place where our sort of traditional training or approaching means of approaching things can fall short. We're often trained to jump directly to a familiar statistical approach when confronted with a familiar type of data, instead of really starting by asking, okay, what is my causal question? And here the advances in formal causal frameworks over really the past decades can be tremendously useful. I think the key concept here is to start by saying, what is the ideal hypothetical experiment or protocol that I'd like to run? So by ideal here, we don't mean ideal from a patient perspective or an ethical perspective, but ideal in the sense of what sort of an experiment would really allow me to learn what it is I want to learn. And so to build on our running example here, we started off by saying, okay, what about if all patients in our target population took degludec versus largine 300? How would their hemoglobin A1C compare? But as Henrik started off the day-to-day bringing up, what about changes in treatment over time? Patients might switch treatments, interrupt, discontinue entirely. And these are just one example of all the things we might like to account for when we're designing our ideal experiment to really answer our causal question of interest. So here, this is where the formal causal framework gives us the tools to really specify our ideal protocol, sometimes called a longitudinal treatment regime. So just to take an example, we might say, no, my ideal experiment is where I take all my patients, they all start a specific insulin analog, say degludec, they remain on that initial drug for the full follow-up period. We make sure that specific background rescue therapies are used or not used, and maybe we also prevent treatment interruptions. Now, there's nothing magical about this sort of a regime, but it really is just an example of the flexibility that these frameworks give us to define our question based on what it is we really want to know. So we now have a language for doing that, but that doesn't mean it's easy to then move to a statistical estimand. And this is where the challenge of post-baseline confounding, really confounding by these intercurrent events, comes up. So say now we're interested in this difference in hemoglobin A1C under degludec versus largine 300 under this ideal protocol, which says, don't interrupt or switch. So here's a simplified causal graph that shows how we might represent that, simplified just for illustration purposes to just 2 time points. So here we have, say, some baseline risk factors, our classic confounders that affect whether you get the insulin analog at the start of the study and the outcome. And these are things that do raise challenges when we want to adjust for them, but are kind of how we've classically thought about confounders. However, in addition, your initial choice of insulin analog may actually affect your initial response. So early markers of how well a patient is doing. And based on that initial response, that might first affect their final outcome, but also help to determine whether or not they stay on their initial insulin analog or switch to a new one. So this is a classic example of a post-baseline confounder. We need to adjust for this initial response in order to control confounding of the effect of insulin analog decisions at later time points on the final outcome, but it's also on the causal pathway from earlier choices of insulin analog to the final outcome. And so we don't have a lot of choices here with standard statistics. We can't just fit an outcome regression among those who don't switch. So in other words, censor its switch, because we haven't accounted for this selection bias, the fact that those who switch are at higher risk. And if we then censor its switch, what are we doing? We're essentially blocking or adjusting away part of this effective interest. So essentially our usual toolbox of parametric outcome regressions really falls short when we're faced with this real world problem. So now we've got a statistical gap, but we've really also got a causal gap. So say we start with a causal question that says, how did A1C differ under degludec versus glargine with no switches or interruptions? Standard approaches really don't get us to a statistical target parameter estimand that corresponds to that causal question. In other words, this question simply doesn't correspond to some coefficient in any regression. And then beyond that, we've got this issue of kind of closing the statistical gap or making sure that we have statistical approaches that when confronted with real world problems are able to give us reliable inference. Of course, that's just one example of a question that we could ask. So many more causal questions that we could pose. So we could look instead at dynamic treatment protocols that respond to patient events. Some examples of ideal protocols here. What about strategies for deciding when to initiate or when to intensify or when to switch therapy? For example, intensify or switch when hemoglobin A1C exceeds some threshold, or which is a totally reasonable clinical thing to do, a strategy that says, take this insulin analog, but switch if the patient experiences the following adverse events. We can also look at treatment assignment based on predicted patient response. So again, so much interest in uncovering heterogeneity in which treatments work for best patients. We could use this same sort of causal framework to frame causal questions around which way of assigning treatment is going to give the best response. How can we use patient characteristics to predict who's going to do well with which treatment and use that to assign which drug they get? So total flexibility with causal frameworks to define these, but again, they don't correspond to any classical statistical parameter. So here we are, we set off hopefully in search of the truth. And here's our causal target, although we've learned that it may not just correspond to an off-the-shelf coefficient in a statistical regression that we're used to, but so many opportunities to get lost. We can get lost in terms of sort of overstating our certainty. I'm close to the target, I know I am. We could get lost just simply not even having any idea how close to our target we've ended up, or even kind of losing track of where it was we were trying to go to begin with. And now finally is the last part of motivation before we move into the roadmap itself. As Henrik introduced, we've kind of started off by motivating with observational studies, but randomized trials face the same challenges. I love the slide that shows the overlapping Venn diagrams, pointing out that really once we're really clear about all the questions we want to ask with our trial data and all the things that actually happen, even in the course of the best conducted randomized trials, all of a sudden randomized trials start to share a lot of characteristics with observational data. Absolutely, it's great to have randomization when you can, but it simply doesn't solve all of our problems. So we heard about some of those first thing this morning: adherence, patient dropout, treatment modifications, protocol deviations, all reasons we might want to move away from an sort of standard intent to treat analysis. And then on top of that, there's this issue that we could get more from our trials in terms of precision. So adjustment for baseline characteristics that predict our outcome can improve our precision, but of course they have to be pre-specified. And if we take sort of a rigid pre-specified approach to adjustment, that can also fail to perform in terms of failing to deliver us the precision gains that we could get out of our baseline covariates. So to sum up then, we can and we should use our trial data to go after more relevant questions, such as per protocol analyses, treatment effect heterogeneity. But as soon as we do that, we're heading back into the woods. So we've still got this explosion of possible paths. So with that as motivation then, I would say we need a roadmap. So what does this roadmap look like? It breaks down into a few key components. First, the causal question. So we start off with the roadmap, really defining our causal question in terms of thinking hard about our ideal experimental conditions. And again, this doesn't have to be a feasible experiment, a possible experiment. Really, we're thinking about if we could hypothetically intervene on the world to make conditions exactly what we wanted them to be, how would we intervene? What would we change? What would we leave the same? And so in our running example, we can say, what's the difference in hemoglobin A1C under two ideal longitudinal protocols where we really specify all the aspects of that protocol that we care about. The second component is to really clearly specify our observed data and statistical model. Now, there's nothing causal about this step. This is good statistics, but nonetheless, it's a crucial part of the roadmap. I think the key point to make here is that our goal is really to also close that statistical gap to ensure we get reliable inference. And to make sure we do that, we want to use statistical models that are actually big enough, flexible enough that we know they contain the true observed data distribution. So in other words, our statistical model should reflect our uncertainty. It should reflect our imperfect knowledge of the world. And that's a place where sort of classic parametric models often fall apart. And if we're honest about how much we know about the world, we are really forced to move into the world of semi-parametric or non-parametric, large non-parametric statistical models. So we've got our causal question, we've got our observed data and statistical model. What we want to do then is translate that causal question into a statistical target parameter, some parameter of our observed data distribution. So this is this key process of moving from the causal world to the statistical world. And in doing that, what we generally use are formal causal models, such as directed acyclic graphs, to help us understand exactly what the causal assumptions are that will allow us to make this translation. And that also can do things like inform us, okay, which variables do we need to adjust for? How can we adjust for them? How can we do this translation exercise even in cases like we showed before that have time-dependent confounding? And then finally, once we get to a statistical target parameter, a statistical model in the observed data, we have a classic statistical estimation problem, but we still need to solve it well. And so we still need rigorous statistical estimators that are able to flexibly learn from data while still maintaining the basis of statistical inference. And then finally, we get to the end with our estimate, and we can talk about then interpreting our statistical estimate, either in terms of a statistical interpretation or in terms of providing an answer to the causal question. So let's just step through the steps of this roadmap with the time that remains to us. And I just want to highlight a few of the benefits, I think, of using this in practice. And I will say this is something that has certainly transformed my own applied statistics practice. And I joke with my students that every time I get lazy and think, oh, I don't really need to go through this whole formal process. I've done this so many times, I have it in my head, it'll be fine. And I try to skip steps, it always goes badly wrong. So I'm evangelical about the roadmap, but evangelical based on many years of past experience where it's really helped me I really feel I get to better answers with real questions. So what are some kind of useful aspects of this roadmap? First, I would say framing better questions. So really making sure that we're starting off with causal questions that reflect what we really want to know. So not causal questions that are kind of chosen backwards by convenience based on kind of the data that we have in front of us and the statistical methods that happen to be handy. And then we say, oh gosh, if we make some assumptions, maybe that answers something causal, but maybe it's not even the causal thing I cared about. Instead, we start with our causal question. What is the scientific question we want to know? And we have the flexibility to define that. Second, I think it's a reminder to use better statistical models. And this is just a plea, you know, we hear all models are wrong. All models are not wrong if we allow them to accurately reflect our uncertainty. And so this is really this key stage that we need to be working with statistical estimators that give us valid inference, working when they're faced with statistical models that are truly large, that are large enough to actually reflect uncertainty and therefore not be wrong. Third, better estimands. So because we go through this kind of stepwise process of starting with a causal question we care about, and then being clear about our causal assumptions, in this identification step, we end up with estimands or statistical target parameters that are actually closer to our causal question. Now, of course, there's no free lunch. It's not like we magically wave a wand and causality appears out of incredibly flawed real world data, but at least we have clearly articulated what it is we want, what it is we know, whether what we know is enough to get us to a statistical parameter, and if not, what additional things would we need to know, and then what that statistical parameter is. So we end up with a statistics problem that's as close as it can possibly be to the causal question, as well as an understanding of what the assumptions are exactly that, that are required to give it a causal interpretation. And then finally, better estimators. So again, estimators that are less biased, less variable, and can give us accurate statistical inference, even these larger statistical models. And then through being really clear about our assumptions, improve transparency. So we'll just step through these in turn with examples. And I think one thing that I often encounter when I talk about this roadmap is a lot of people say, well, isn't this just good practice? Isn't this just common sense? And I would just like to say it is good practice. It is common sense. These are principles that you should have learned and would have learned before. And I think that's the power of the roadmap. It's build on our good practice, build on our common sense, but actually get formal tools that will let us take that good practice and common sense further, that will let us get beyond sort of where common sense will take us. And I think we take that for granted when we think about statistics, right? That kind of staring at patterns of data, data visualization can be helpful, but there are a lot of statistical tools that can help us get beyond our intuition. And I think the same can really be said for tackling real world problems with a causal roadmap. So with that said, we want to start with our causal questions. Of course, this is good practice. We want to state our question clearly, our target population, our time point, our outcome, our exposure. What the roadmap teaches us, though, is that we should be explicit about all the aspects of this ideal experiment. It really reminds us to stop and very clearly specify what are these ideal protocols? What variables would we intervene on to control? How? And this can also include things like measurement frequency or follow-up or prevention of missing data. We also should be very clear what variables we don't intervene on. So maybe we don't want to intervene on competing risks, for example, or maybe we don't want to intervene on adherence if that's part of the effect we're interested in. So in our running example, we could say, initiate degludec, remain on initial assignment with no switches unless clinically indicated, and allow for imperfect adherence to capture real world effects. So the other key piece here is really having a formal language for expressing our causal knowledge. And this is where structural causal models or causal graphs can really come in handy. So the structural causal models are a sort of unifying approach to thinking about our causal knowledge. And I think are incredibly useful because they bring together the worlds of causal graphs, structural equation models, and potential outcomes. So what are these causal models? They let us represent the real world process or experiment that gave rise to our data. So here's our example from before with just limited 2 time points where we said we had baseline risk factors that affected initial decisions, which insulin analog to use, and also the outcome. But then we also have this initial response, which affects subsequent decisions of which analog to use and the outcome, but also could be affected by baseline risk factors and initial treatment decisions. So again, to echo this theme of all models are not wrong, all statistical models are not wrong, but all causal models are not wrong either. So I think one really appealing thing about the use of causal graphs is their ability to incorporate uncertainty. If we don't know if an effect exists, we just include an arrow in our causal graph or our underlying structural equation model framework. And we also don't need to specify any functional forms. So this is really a departure from, I think, the long history of parametric structural equation modeling, for example, in econometrics. And this is really an approach that has been championed by Judea Pearl. For those who don't know him, I can't recommend his books highly enough. He's really transformed the thinking around causal inference. So causal models can express what we know about the data generating process we got to observe, but they can also describe our ideal experiment. And this is where the link to potential outcomes or counterfactual outcomes come in. So we could say, okay, in our ideal experiment, we want to initiate degludec and stay on it with no modifications. So here's our model of the system we got to observe. Now we can think about intervening on it to describe our ideal experiment. So here's our modified causal model, where we say, okay, no, we want to intervene to set insulin use at time 0 and insulin use at time 1. And what's generated by that modified system of equations, by that modified graph, is the counterfactual outcome, the hemoglobin A1C under the ideal degludec protocol. So we could do that for degludec, and then maybe we would also do it for glargine 300. So now we have two counterfactual outcomes or potential outcomes that reflect hemoglobin A1C under the ideal degludec protocol and under the ideal glargine protocol. So that brings us to this final part of the first step of the roadmap. We want to go from this causal question framed in terms of words to really a causal question framed as a formal causal parameter or as a parameter of the distribution of counterfactual outcomes. So this is an extremely useful concept, a counterfactual outcome, which is really the outcome that would have been observed under the ideal treatment regime of interest. So we might, for notation, call this Y1, the counterfactual outcome or hemoglobin A1C, if a patient had, possibly contrary to fact, received glargine 300 and followed the ideal protocol. And Y0 being hemoglobin A1C if a patient had, possibly contrary to fact, received degludec and followed the protocol. And then we can define finally our target causal parameter as some function of these unobserved counterfactual outcome distributions. So for example, we might go after the causal relative risk of poor control at some pre-specified time point if all patients had complied with glargine 300 versus degludec. Of course, as we noted in our motivation, there's nothing that means we have to look at these fixed treatment regimes. We can also look at so-called dynamic treatment regimes or patient responsive or personalized treatment rules. So what are these patient responsive or personalized treatment rules? They basically say, okay, my ideal experiment would be to assign a value to my treatment at each time point, but as some function that I get to decide on as the researcher, as some function of that patient's characteristics. So this is helpful because maybe we have some dynamic regimes or personalized rules in mind up front. So maybe we just want to say, take degludec unless you develop adverse effects. However, we can also even go beyond that. And that also gets to one of the questions in the Q&A at the last session. We could say, actually, can we learn from the data what's the best way to assign a treatment at each time point based on a patient's measured characteristics up till that time point? This is sometimes called an optimal dynamic regime. So we could think of some rule D star that we don't know that says assign one insulin analog versus the other based on some optimal strategy, where we actually want to use the data as well to estimate that strategy. And so here again, we could think about counterfactual outcomes, but now these are the counterfactual outcomes defined under this ideal or optimal personalized treatment rule. And once we have these counterfactual outcomes, we can define target parameters in terms of it. So we can talk about how the expected counterfactual outcome would vary if each patient were assigned a drug at each time point that he or she was predicted to respond to best. And so now we're really opening the door for asking these questions about how we can best assign the treatments that we have available to optimize patient outcomes. So that brings us to the second step of the roadmap. In step 2, we want to use specify our observed data and our statistical model. So our causal model was really our way of expressing our knowledge about the data generating process. At this point, we're going from our causal model, which is what we know, to our observed data, which is what we measure. and a statistical model for that observed data. So here again, we're very clear about what we mean by a statistical model. It's the set of possible observed data distributions. Now, here again, we have good practice to draw on. We want to use an appropriate statistical model. We want to use one that fits well. Our roadmap teaches us, though, that really what we want to do is we don't want to choose that model after looking at the data and deciding, exactly as Thomas nicely pointed out. We really want to start with a statistical model that reflects our uncertainty. And if we do that, if we work with a large enough model, a semi-parametric or non-parametric statistical model, we're able to ensure that our model actually contains the true observed data distribution and thereby lay the basis for valid statistical inference. So now to identification. So this is where we want to go from a causal question specified in terms of a parameter of counterfactual outcome distributions to a statistical question specified as a parameter of the observed data distribution. Because if we do that, we're in business. We are back in the world of statistics. So our question stated in terms of counterfactual quantities, what things would have looked like under different conditions than we observed. So now we want to really say, can we translate this into a statistical parameter? And if so, what is that parameter? Here again, we have sort of good practice and training to draw on. We're taught that we want to, for example, choose variables to allow us to control for confounding. What I think the roadmap, and in particular using a structural causal model, gets us is it gets us further insight into how to do that. So it doesn't magically deal with unmeasured confounding, but even this process of figuring out what's the best way we can control for confounding in terms of defining a statistical parameter, given what we measure, is a very complex thing where our intuition frequently breaks down. And using the structural causal model framework and a roadmap really gets us beyond that intuition often to non-standard estimands or non-standard statistical parameters. So just to take one example of that, here was our motivating example at the first part of the talk where we said, okay, what if we're, even in this very simplified case where we're just interested in the cumulative effect of taking, say, deglu-dec at both the first and the second time points, or in other words, a regime that just says start with one insulin analog and don't switch. And then we're going to compare that to starting with the other insulin analog and not switching. Even in this relatively simple question, we immediately run into this issue of time-dependent confounding, where we have these post-baseline variables that we need to adjust for to control for the confounding of post-baseline treatments on the outcome, but are also affected by earlier treatment decisions. And so this brings us, this is just a great example of where using a formal causal framework can really lead to a different estimand. So in this case, it turns out that even though there's not one set of adjustment variables that's going to be sufficient to control for confounding in this case, we can still identify our target causal question. We really can still do this translation process from our causal question to a statistical parameter. We just need a new estimand. And so in this case, one estimand that will get us that is the so-called longitudinal G computation formula. This was introduced by Jamie Robbins in the early 1980s. I think is one of the again, just seminal contributions to causal inference for real world problems. So what does this look like? I won't add too much notation at this point in the course, but the basic idea is that we end up with an estimand that's composed of factors that capture the effects of the intervention on the outcome, but also that make sure to capture the effects of the intervention on the outcome mediated by, in this case, this time-dependent confounder or initial response. And so that brings us to our estimator. So at this point, we've gone through this roadmap. We've really translated we've been very clear about our ideal causal question, our observed data and statistical model that reflects our uncertainty. We've used the causal framework, and in particular, causal graphs can be very helpful here to translate that causal question into a statistical target parameter. And so now we're really in the land of statistics. We've got observed data, statistical model, statistical target parameter. We carry on with our statistics. But of course, as we started off this talk by saying that the pre-specification of statistical estimators that really give us good performance in these larger statistical models is still absolutely a challenge. And so here we are again, we've taught good practice. We want to choose an estimator with good statistical properties. And we've also spent some time saying that really our statistical model that we pre-specify should reflect our uncertainty. So we want to be sure we're working in models that are big enough to actually constrain the true data, the true observed data distribution. And often those are semi or non-parametric statistical models. And so what that means is we need estimators that have good properties in these larger models. And so good properties, all our usual properties that minimize bias, that minimize variance, that provide us with accurate inference. So again, thinking back, we need estimators that help us navigate this tension or navigate this path through the woods. We need pre-specification as a principle of statistics, as a principle of inference. But we also need flexibility because real world relationships are complex and because we simply don't understand them fully. So we just have a lot of uncertainty about the way the real world works. And so this brings us to a core component of the causal inference roadmap, which is this idea of targeted machine learning or targeted machine learning estimation or targeted maximum likelihood estimation, as it's sometimes called, or TMLE. And really here we can think of two components. So the first is machine learning. Here I'll talk about super learning, which is really a type of ensemble machine learning. So the idea here is, yes, there's a lot we don't know. We want to look at the data to be flexible, but we need to do that in a pre-specified, rigorous, and automated way in order to make sure that our statistical estimator really is fully pre-specified, that it really is an algorithm. And so what superlearning lets us do is it really gives us an approach to choose between and combine these candidate approaches. Candidate machine learning approaches. So it lets us look at, for example, different parametric regression models we might be interested in, but also different machine learning methods. And then the second step we'll talk about briefly is really this targeting step, which says, take that initial machine learning fit, but then target it in a way that focuses on the estimand itself or the statistical target parameter, and update that initial fit to give us the best possible estimate for the statistical quantity we care about. So with my remaining minutes, I'll give a quick overview of each of those. So first, what's superlearning? As I said, it's really a form of ensemble machine learning, and it's based on the sort of basic premise that there's a whole world of wonderful machine learning algorithms out there. And there's also a whole world of expert knowledge out there. So experts actually may be able to write down good parametric models. We just don't want to bet on them being correctly specified. So what superlearning does is it really sets up a competition of these different algorithms, different machine learning approaches, different parametric model-based approaches. And then what it does is instead of choosing a winner-takes-all approach, instead it chooses the best convex combination of algorithms. This is also the idea from generalized stacking. And when we talk about best, of course, we have to be clear about performance. And so performance here is really judged on independent data using V-fold cross-validation. So for those who are not familiar with V-fold cross-validation, the concept is that we have all of these competing algorithms. We split the data into, in this case, 10 equal parts. Then we run each of our competing algorithms on 9/10 of the data and evaluate their performance using some pre-specified loss function on the remaining 1/10. We repeat that for each of the folds in turn, and now we get 10 measures of performance, all based on independent data, so data that the algorithms didn't get to use when they were generating, say, their fit of the regression function. And we can then compare their performance and choose either the algorithm or the convex combination of algorithms that performs the best. And so here's just a quick example of a superlearner applied to a number of publicly available data sets. So what it's plotting here is relative mean squared error relative to just a linear main term regression against a whole bunch of different possible machine learning algorithms, and then this convex combination built using V-fold cross-validation. And really just illustrating the point that, for example, if we focus on random forest, in some cases it might do well, but in some cases it might do terribly. And we won't always know ahead of time which case we're in. And so one way of thinking about this is if you have an algorithm you think performs well, by all means, include it in the competition, include it in the library. It won't hurt you. And if it does great, it'll get selected. And you don't run the risk of sort of putting all your eggs in one basket and counting on it to perform well in that particular case. So then finally, the second step of the targeted learning estimation piece is this focus where we now take that initial estimator coming from super learning and then focus on the estimand to give a better estimate for this quantity. And so the motivation for this is really, so you might say, well, why is there a motivation for this? Why don't we just stop at super learning, stop at machine learning? We've all heard how machine learning is gonna save the world. So we could just say, use super learner to fit an outcome regression. Now we have an outcome regression. Why not just plug it in and give ourselves, for example, an estimator for the average treatment effect? I think the intuition for this, which many may be familiar with, is we pay a price for too much ambition. So our super learner is trying to do a good job on a harder question. It's trying to fit that entire outcome regression. But that's not actually what we need. That's not our statistical target parameter. And the costs of this sort of extreme ambition are increased bias and variance and really giving up the ability for reliable inference. And so that then is really the emphasis of the targeting step, is to update that initial super learner fit, stop trying to do a good job for all causal questions at once, focus instead on, focus our estimation where it matters most for the question at hand. And it turns out that when we do this targeting step, this update typically depends on other nuisance parameters like the propensity score, for example. So this just to make the point that targeted learning really is a very general statistical methodology. A couple books shown here by Mark Vonderlaan and Sherry Rose, and it can be applied to a range of causally and non-causally motivated statistical quantities. Again, the kind of core components are the use of state-of-the-art machine learning with then outputs updated in a targeted way, where this targeting step is an opportunity to reduce bias, reduce variance, and really regain the statistical properties we need for that reliable inference. A number of appealing properties, and we're going to be hearing more of about those in greater detail over the next 2 days. Efficiency, so minimal asymptotic variance, as well as generally nice robustness properties. So finally, that brings us to our last step of the roadmap, interpretation. And so here again, I think good practice that we've all been taught is to be transparent and state our assumptions clearly. I would say that what using a roadmap gives us is the ability to optimize our interpretability and sort of this transparency, reproducibility. So reproducibility, because we've really ensured that our entire estimation process was fully pre-specified as an algorithm. Interpretability in the sense that we started with a question that we really cared about and then carefully translated it into a statistical estimation problem. And then I think transparency, because using a formal causal model really makes transparent what exactly are the untestable assumptions that we need to be able to move from a statistical interpretation of our results to a causal interpretation. And so here I think one way of thinking about what we get out of this process is really a hierarchy of interpretations. So a statistical interpretation we always have as long as we used a good estimator. So this is really where targeted learning comes in. It gives us an estimator that gives us reliable statistical inference. As always, you know, there are assumptions, and we'll talk a little bit about those in the coming days, but it really opens this door to reliable statistical inference, even when we're working in these large models that represent what we know about the world. And then finally, a causal interpretation, if we're willing to make those additional causal assumptions about the data generating process. And again, these are fundamentally untestable with just the data alone, but are nonetheless essential for causal inference. And so what using the roadmap does, it doesn't magically give us causal inference, but it really makes those assumptions very clear, very transparent, and very explicit. And therefore, you know, they become assumptions that we can discuss as subject matter experts to decide whether we think they're reasonable or what we might want to do or measure to make them more reasonable. So to conclude then, targeted learning is really a general toolbox. It's a way of combining these causal frameworks, machine learning, and statistical theory to give us better, more precise answers to causal, so actionable questions with accurate quantification of uncertainty. So coming up in the next couple days, tomorrow we'll dive into a few more in-depth case studies based on randomized control trials with time to event outcomes, as well as see some highlights of other real-world examples of targeted learning. And then on the third day, October 28th, we will look at a case study in HIV to really get some more depth on some of these more complex causal questions that targeted learning can let us address, such as longitudinal and dynamic regimes, as well as talk about some of areas of challenge, ongoing work, and future directions with the causal roadmap. And so with that, I will conclude and say thank you and looking forward to questions. This is me on my 10th anniversary backpacking with my husband, and I will say that we got quite lost. So I thought it was an appropriate picture to conclude with in plea of the use of a causal roadmap. So thank you. All right. And I think I have some time for questions. Please feel free to type any questions into the chat, or you can also raise your hand and Andrew can call on you. And I see there are a couple here. So the first two from Torkild. So I will start by reading these. When thinking about conditions for clinical decision-making, how can we bypass the intention to treat analysis where the randomization imitates the point of decisions? I'm not sure I totally understand it, but I will take a pass at it. I think that the framing of clinical questions, the framing of causal questions when analyzing data should start with the clinical decision-making process. I think that historically the order of things has gotten mixed up, and that is the first thing we do is spend real time making sure we understand the clinical decision-making process and making sure we understand what are the key questions there. What would be helpful to know to directly inform the clinical decision-making process? I'm not saying that's the only category of causal questions, but that's a very important one. And I think if we start with that, it immediately becomes clear that almost no clinician wants an intent to treat parameter. And so we bypass ending up with that analysis as the default simply by starting with a clear framing of our question. Now, the other thing I would say though is, of course, there's a very good reason why intent to treat analyses have had such a predominant role in randomized control trial, primary analysis, and regulation. It's because very appropriately, we want our analyses, our trials, our regulatory science to be as robust as they can possibly be. And so again, I think this is an example not of kind of silliness, but really of the fact that until I'd say fairly recently, we haven't had the tools we needed to actually be able to rigorously and robustly push past intent to treat analysis to go after more interesting questions. But that's why I'm really excited both about this kind of moment in time and also about this initiative, because I think we're really at a point where there's been unbelievable progress over the past decades. And we're really at a point now where I think we can actually really start to do that more effectively. I don't know, does anybody else on the call want to jump in though? I've been talking for an hour, so. Clinical decision-making and bypassing the intent to treat analysis.
I would maybe only add that the intent to treat could, of course, be the question of interest, right? And number one, it's something which usually you can estimate more robustly because you can rely on the randomization assumption. While if you move away from the intent to treat, you suddenly are in this world of, real observational data. But it also might actually be the question of interest in the sense that, maybe, you assign this treatment, but there is non-compliance because of side effects or whatever. That's still a very interesting question. In this real world where you give people this drug, how does it work out? I mean, I'm sure we can think of other examples. But that's all I would add.
And so maybe a follow-up question to that was that perhaps the point of the clinician is they're not interested in causal inference, but what the effects are of the decisions made. And so I think I would answer that by saying that is causal inference. I mean, I think this may be another place where it's exciting to think about these webinars. It's exciting to think about teaching papers. It's exciting to think about really democratization of these methods, because in my experience, clinicians absolutely want to be able to ask about the effects of their decisions, about the best ways to treat their patients. And I think what they're not always aware of is the ability of really the modern toolbox to take exactly those questions and translate them under assumptions, of course, no magic wizards, but translate those questions that they do care about with clearly stated assumptions into statistical problems. And so I think maybe the history of causal inference has come from one direction and sort of clinical decision-making from another. And so really there's this translation or this communication need, I think right now, to make sure that it's clear that we actually have tools now to frame causal questions that directly go after these questions that clinicians are posing. Any other Q&A? One more. So we rarely address only a single question, but also whether the average effect depends on age, sex, etc. So absolutely. And I think that is also an important point. So two things. One is thinking about how the effect differs depending on different patient characteristics. I think that's one of the really incredibly exciting aspects of the modern toolbox. Is, we're sort of used to thinking about having like 3 or 5 subgroups that we have to pre-specify for good reason, because we get into multiple testing issues. We say, okay, I'm maybe interested in the average treatment effect, and then these small number of pre-specified subgroups. What we really care about, though, is understanding what profiles of patients are likely to respond to a specific drug. And it may not be a single subgroup that actually lets us capture that, right? Maybe it's some combination of variables on those patients. And maybe they're not things we understand ahead of time. And so one thing that this toolbox gives us is it actually lets us say, okay, our target question here is what way of assigning treatment based on a whole bunch of patient characteristics is actually going to give the best outcome? And then learn from the data what that combination of characteristics is and still get inference, which I to this day find sort of jaw-dropping. Again, there are assumptions, but really opening up a way forward from the kind of limitations we've had with focusing on just a few pre-specified subgroup analyses, and still be able to get inference for more of these complex parameters. I think there's an additional question implied here, really, which has to do with, of course, we're interested in more than one question with a single data set. And I think that is an interesting question as well, which is, how should we most effectively be conceptualizing, for example, multiple testing when the questions are posed with this roadmap and used with these estimators, but we still have multiple questions. And I think it is 10, so I will pause there, but that's an outstanding and interesting topic. Would anybody like to add anything before we wrap up the first day of the webinar? Great. So just like to then conclude by saying, please join us for the next 2 days. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday at the same time, October 28th. And then the third meeting of the webinar will be done on Friday, October 30th. And please note the time change on Friday, it will start 1 hour earlier. Please feel free to send us any questions. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. And many thanks all.